We have always been told the same thing. Ancient stone structures were places of worship, burial, and ceremony. They were built to honor gods, to house the dead, to mark the passage of kings. This explanation appears in textbooks, in documentaries, in every museum exhibit that has ever placed a photograph of a pyramid or a standing stone beside a paragraph of careful academic language. It is a story told with confidence, repeated without much friction, and accepted without much question. And on the surface, it is not entirely wrong. But it may not be entirely complete either. But set the story aside for a moment. Look at the structures themselves, not what we have been told they mean, but what they actually are. Look at the geometry of the internal chambers, the way certain passages align with mathematical consistency, the way sound behaves inside specific rooms carved from solid rock. Look at the precision of the joints, the repetition of certain angles across sites that have no known connection to each other, the structural decisions that seem far too deliberate, far too engineered, to exist purely for symbolic effect. No one builds to that level of tolerance simply to impress a god. At some point, the architecture stops looking like devotion and starts looking like intention of a different kind entirely. Not a conspiracy, not a myth, just an honest architectural observation that the accepted story has never quite found room for. The builders knew something. The question is what? Take a thin piece of paper. Now try to slide it between two stones that have been sitting together for 4,000 years. At Sacsayhuaman in Peru, you cannot. The polygonal limestone blocks, some weighing more than 100 tons, none of them rectangular, none of them uniform, fit together across their irregular faces with a contact so complete that no gap exists to measure. The same is true inside the chambers of the Great Pyramid, where the granite surfaces meet with tolerances that modern metrologists have measured at less than half a millimeter across spans of several feet. At the Osirian at Abydos, basalt blocks of extraordinary size were placed with a flatness and alignment that engineers who have examined them describe not with admiration but with something closer to discomfort. Because here is the part that does not resolve easily. Modern stonemasons working with diamond-tipped blades, laser levels, and decades of professional experience have attempted to replicate this kind of surface contact across irregular polygonal shapes and fallen short. Not by much, but by enough to matter. The question is not whether the ancient builders were skilled. Clearly they were. The question is what kind of process produces this result, and whether any motivation rooted purely in ceremony would have demanded it. What makes this harder to set aside is that Sacsayhuaman and the Great Pyramid are not alone. Travel to Baalbek in Lebanon, and you will find a stone platform whose lower courses contain individual blocks weighing upward of 800 tons, dressed and placed with the same obsessive flatness. Walk the lower levels of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and the same polygonal fitting style appears again, massive, irregular, mortarless, precise. Cross an ocean to Pumapunku in Bolivia, and the H-shaped andesite blocks scattered across that high plateau show machined grooves, perfectly replicated angles, and drill-like holes that appear in multiples with identical dimensions. Move further still to the megalithic sites of coastal Japan, to the stone platforms of ancient Turkey, to the cyclopean walls that appear across the Mediterranean without clear origin or clear explanation. The orthodox answer is parallel development, separate cultures independently arriving at the same solutions. But parallel development typically produces similar ideas, not identical tolerances. It explains the concept of a wall. It does not easily explain why walls separated by 10,000 miles share the same jointing technique, the same polygonal logic, and the same level of surface precision. Something connects these sites. Whether that something was a shared technology, a shared body of knowledge, or something else entirely, the pattern itself is not imaginary. There is something unusual about the King's Chamber inside the Great Pyramid. It is not the size, though the room is larger than most people expect. It is not the granite walls, though they are smoother than the stone around them. It is what happens when sound enters the room. Researchers who have studied the acoustic behavior of that chamber have measured a resonant frequency that the space amplifies naturally, without any additional engineering, sitting at a range that corresponds to the low end of human hearing, a frequency that, under sustained exposure, has measurable effects on human neurological states. This is not a fringe claim. It has been measured. Now consider the Halsaflini hypogeum in Malta, an underground complex carved from limestone roughly 5,000 years ago. Acoustic researchers from the University of Malta found that the chambers amplify sound at around 110 Hz with remarkable consistency, and that this frequency range is associated with shifts in human brain activity, specifically in the patterns linked to meditative and trance-like states. The Corbeld chambers at Newgrange in Ireland produce similar standing wave behavior. 3 sites, 3 different cultures, 3 different centuries, and the same acoustic result. At what point does a repeated measurable effect stop being coincidence and start being design? These were not echo chambers built for pleasure. The geometry required to produce these results is specific. Someone understood what they were building well enough to build it correctly. The acoustic behavior is only one layer. Step outside the chambers and look at the structures themselves in relation to the sky, and a second pattern emerges that is equally difficult to explain away. At Newgrange, a narrow roof box positioned above the entrance allows a single shaft of sunlight to travel the full length of the inner passage and illuminate the back wall of the chamber for exactly 17 minutes on the winter solstice morning. The alignment is accurate to within a fraction of a degree. At Chichen Itza, the stepped pyramid of Kukulkan is oriented so precisely that on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the angle of afternoon sunlight creates a shadow pattern along the northern staircase that produces the unmistakable silhouette of a descending serpent. The effect lasts for approximately 40 minutes and then disappears completely. At Karnak, the great hypostyle hall is oriented to receive the light of the midsummer sunrise directly along its central axis. At Göbekli Tepe, structures dating back 12,000 years show clear astronomical orientations that required advanced knowledge of stellar movement to produce. And running beneath all of these alignments is a current of mathematics that has unsettled researchers for decades. The dimensions of the Great Pyramid encode pi and phi with an accuracy that should not exist in a structure built with ropes and copper tools. Some researchers have noted that the speed of light, expressed in meters per second, corresponds precisely to the geographical coordinates of the pyramid's location. Whether intentional or not, these numbers are there. They do not belong to a civilization that was simply reaching for the sky in praise. At Baalbek in Lebanon, 3 stones sit in a retaining wall that archaeologists call the trilithon. Each one weighs approximately 800 tons. A 4th stone, still partially embedded in a nearby quarry, weighs an estimated 1,200 tons, making it the largest work stone block in the known ancient world. It was cut, shaped, and partially moved. No one agrees on how. Experimental archaeologists have spent decades attempting to demonstrate period-appropriate methods for moving stones at this scale: wooden sledges, water lubrication, rope systems, human labor in carefully coordinated teams. These experiments are earnest and intelligent. They have successfully moved stones weighing several tons. At 10 tons the methods begin to strain. At 50 tons they become theoretical. At 800 tons they stop being demonstrated and start being assumed. The colossi of Memnon in Egypt each sit on base stones weighing over 700 tons, transported from a quarry more than 400 miles away. The limestone casing blocks of the Great Pyramid average 2.5 tons each, but the granite blocks deeper inside the structure weigh up to 80 tons and were somehow raised to heights exceeding 50 meters. The builders were not primitive. Every evidence of their intelligence is written in the structures themselves. But the gap between the tools the record shows and the results the stones represent has never been honestly closed. Something is missing from the explanation. Above the king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid sit 5 low compartments stacked directly on top of one another, collectively known as the relieving chambers. The official explanation is that they were built to distribute the weight of the pyramid above and protect the ceiling of the room below. This is reasonable as far as it goes. But the chambers are also sealed, inaccessible, and shaped in ways that produce specific acoustic effects when sound is introduced into the system from below. Whether they are purely structural, or something more has never been definitively settled. Below the pyramid, a subterranean chamber cut directly into the bedrock sits unfinished by all appearances, its purpose listed in most literature as unknown. Beneath the pyramid at Giza and at several other sites across Egypt and Central America, networks of underground passages and chambers exist whose ceremonial function has never been convincingly explained. In Scotland, certain ancient hill forts contain stonework that has been vitrified, fused by heat into a glassy, hardened surface that requires temperatures no wood fire can produce. No one has fully explained how or why, and inside the Great Pyramid, the granite coffer in the king's chamber is too large to have been carried through the doorway of the room it sits in. It was placed before the walls were built around it. These are not decorative anomalies. Described plainly, without the temple frame around them, they look like components. Set aside the religious framing completely for a moment. Do not replace it with anything dramatic. Just look at what the evidence describes when it is laid out in plain language. You have structures built from granite, a stone that contains quartz crystal in significant quantities. Quartz is piezoelectric, meaning it generates an electrical charge when placed under mechanical pressure, and conversely, it responds to electrical fields with physical vibration. This is not alternative science. It is standard material physics, the same property that made quartz essential to early radio technology, and that still drives the timing mechanisms inside modern electronics. Now consider that the granite chambers inside the Great Pyramid sit above a network of shafts that researchers have confirmed channel water, or once did. Moving water generates a weak but measurable electromagnetic field. Introduce that field into a structure built from piezoelectric stone, shaped into precise geometric proportions, and sealed to produce specific acoustic resonance, and you do not have a tomb. You have something that behaves, at minimum, like a transducer, a device that converts one form of energy into another. Researchers measuring the electromagnetic environment above pyramid sites have recorded anomalies that do not correspond to the surrounding geology. Similar measurements have been taken at megalithic sites in Lebanon and Bolivia. None of this has been fully explained. The hypothesis that follows from this evidence is not that ancient people were visited by outside forces or possessed magical knowledge. It is simpler, and in some ways more unsettling than that. It is that they understood how certain materials, certain geometries, and certain natural forces interact, and that they built accordingly. If the structures themselves suggest a working knowledge of materials science, acoustics, and electromagnetic behavior, then the next question is where that knowledge came from and where it went. Ancient Egyptian texts described construction and ritual processes involving sound in ways that were dismissed for centuries as poetic exaggeration. The Vedic literature of ancient India contains passages describing the use of specific sonic frequencies to influence physical matter descriptions that were filed under mythology until researchers in the field of cymatics began demonstrating that sound waves can indeed organize physical particles into geometric patterns with measurable consistency. Mesoamerican traditions contain similar encoded references to construction knowledge expressed through the language of deity and ritual. The consistent scholarly response has been to read these as metaphor. But metaphor for what, exactly? If a civilization understood that certain frequencies affect stone, water, and human neurological states, and if that civilization wanted to preserve that understanding across generations that might not share the same technical vocabulary, encoding it inside religious language and symbolic architecture would be a remarkably effective strategy. The knowledge would survive even as its original meaning faded. What we have inherited may not be the superstition of primitive people reaching for explanations they could not form. It may be the residue of a coherent empirical system that was never lost so much as gradually misread its instructions still standing in stone, its meaning waiting for us to develop the instruments precise enough to hear it. The ideas explored in this video are no longer confined to the margins of alternative research. In 2008, acoustics researchers at the University of Edinburgh conducted a systematic study of prehistoric carved stone balls found across Scotland, concluding that their geometric properties suggested a sophisticated understanding of mathematical solids that predated Greek formal geometry by thousands of years. Separate research from the same institution examined the acoustic properties of Neolithic monuments, and found that the resonant frequencies produced inside chambered cairns were consistent enough across multiple sites to suggest deliberate acoustic design rather than architectural accident. In 2018, a team of researchers from the Laserzentrum Hanover and the Italian National Research Council published findings showing that the Great Pyramid of Giza concentrates electromagnetic energy in its internal chambers and at its base in ways that are not fully explained by its external geometry alone. The study, published in the Journal of Applied Physics, was careful in its conclusions. It did not claim the pyramid was a machine. It claimed the electromagnetic behavior was measurable, real, and worthy of further study. That is precisely the point. Science has not yet drawn the full conclusion, but it has confirmed that these structures interact with light, sound, and electromagnetic fields in ways that are specific, non-random, and in several cases still without complete explanation. That is no longer a fringe position. It is a finding. Come back to the image you started with. A stone structure, ancient and silent, standing in a landscape that has changed completely around it while the stones themselves have not moved. We gave it a name. We gave it a purpose. We placed it inside a story about gods and kings and the human need to reach towards something larger than daily life. And perhaps that story is true. Perhaps it has always been true. But perhaps it is also incomplete in a way that matters. Because if some of these structures were not only temples but instruments, if the people who built them understood the earth, its materials, its frequencies, and its geometry well enough to build devices that still produce measurable effects thousands of years later, then what we have called religion may have been something richer than we imagined. Not superstition dressed in stone, but knowledge dressed in reverence. The two were perhaps never separate for the people who built these things. The sacred and the functional may have been the same word in a language we have forgotten how to read. The stones have not changed. They still hold their tolerances. They still align with the same stars on the same mornings. They still resonate at the same frequencies inside the same chambers. Whatever they were built to do, they are still doing it. We simply stopped asking what that was. It may be time to ask again.